At 6:22 on a Thursday morning, Fort Liberty, North Carolina, Captain Rachel Marsh was taping her right knee when the battalion radio net went dark. Not static, not interference, dark. She sat on the edge of a folding cot in the back corner of the equipment bay, her hands still mid-wrap, listening to a silence that had the quality of a door slamming shut in another room. Somewhere across the compound, a generator held its indifferent note. Boots crossed gravel. A truck engine turned over and caught. Nothing from the radio. She finished the tape, pulled it firm, overlapping each pass with the precision of someone whose hands no longer needed instructions for this task. 3 bits of titanium held the right knee together, surgical grade, installed 18 months ago after a hard landing on a rain-slicked runway at Bagram that the incident report described as a controlled emergency, and her body still described every cold morning as something else entirely. The tape was not decoration. It was the difference between walking to the aircraft and being carried away from it. She stood, tested the joint. It held. She picked up her knee board from the cot beside her. It was an old thing. Brown leather edging worn smooth at the corners. The Velcro strap replaced twice the clipboard surface scratched from years of metal rings and pencil pressure. Other pilots in the squadron kept digital tablets strapped to their thighs now. Rachel Marsh kept the knee board. Inside it, organized by date and target type, were pages of handwritten notes in a compact, unhurried script. Weapon employment tables, terrain analysis grids, fuel burn calculations worked by hand in case avionics failed, wind shift data logged across different altitudes and valley orientations, cannon harmonics at various airspeed and load configurations. Every number she had ever trusted with her life written in pencil on paper, because paper did not crash and pencil did not run out of battery over hostile ground. She tucked it under her arm and walked out into the morning. The Fort Liberty sun was already hard and flat by the time she crossed the motor pool lot, though it was barely past 6. The air in August smelled of red clay baked to cracking diesel exhaust, and the metallic sharpness of equipment that had been running all night. The low drone of a Chinook lifted somewhere to the north, and beneath that, the closer sound of men loading and checking and preparing for something that had a schedule attached to it. 540 Marines were scheduled to begin a valley sweep operation at 0900. Rachel had been assigned to communications monitoring duty for the duration. She had not argued. She had written it down in the knee board and gone back to her terrain analysis. At the far end of the motor pool, beside a row of up-armored Humvees getting their final gear check, Master Sergeant Holt Pruitt was drinking coffee from a dented thermos and watching his Marines work with the stillness of a man who had learned a long time ago that the most useful thing a senior NCO could do at final prep was stay out of the way and stay awake. He was 62 years old, built like someone who had been large once and had compressed rather than softened with age, his face the color and texture of old saddle leather. He had served in the Gulf in 1991 as a 29-year-old staff sergeant, and the years since had added more service, more deployments, more noise. Until now, he ran the motor pool at Fort Liberty with the unhurried authority of a man who understood that every vehicle that left this compound carried someone's son or daughter inside it. His son's name was Declan. Corporal Declan Pruitt, 22 years old, was currently checking the tie-downs on a troop transport 3 vehicles down the row. Holt watched him without appearing to watch him. It was a skill fathers develop when their children start doing dangerous things, and there is nothing left to say about it. Rachel crossed the lot and stopped beside Pruitt. She did not greet him with anything elaborate. That was not how they operated. She set the knee board on the hood of the nearest Humvee and opened it to a page she had flagged the previous night. Pruitt looked at it. He had looked at enough of her pages to read them without needing explanation. The page showed Kessler Valley in grid format, terrain contour lines in pencil annotated at 3 specific fold points where the ridgeline created natural defilade angles, a hand-drawn overlay of projected firing positions, arrows indicating predicted convoy movement routes, and the corresponding dead ground where RPG teams could position without exposure. At the bottom in Rachel's compact handwriting, a single line, convergent fire, classic kill box, recommend alternate ingress or increased air asset pre-clearance. The report had been submitted through proper channels 17 days ago. Pruitt took a slow sip of coffee. He did not look up from the page. She waited. He said quietly, not making it a question, "They still going in the direct route?" "Yes, Sergeant." He looked down the row of vehicles. At Declan, who was now checking tire pressure with a gauge moving methodically from wheel to wheel, the way his father had taught him to move through any task completely without rushing, without skipping. Pruitt reached into the chest pocket of his uniform and removed a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her without ceremony. She took it and read it. It took her 45 seconds. She read it the way she read everything once, completely without expression. Then she read the key section again. Then she folded it along its original crease and held it in her hand without moving. The document was a printed excerpt from Colonel Grant Weston's official operational planning brief for the Kessler Valley sweep, dated 4 days ago. The terrain analysis section contained 3 paragraphs that she recognized the way you recognize your own handwriting on a page you did not write. The language was slightly restructured. One technical term had been replaced with a synonym. The grid references had been reformatted to match brigade standard. But the content, the specific identification of the convergent ridge geometry, the projection of firing positions, the calculation of dead ground relative to convoy axis was hers. Every analytical judgment, every number. It was her report. Her name was not on it. Her original, submitted through proper channels 17 days ago, had been categorized as a supplemental logistics appendix, assigned the lowest possible priority review code, and buried beneath 43 other documents in the operations folder. Weston's brief cited it nowhere, acknowledged it nowhere. As far as the official record showed, Colonel Grant Weston had independently produced a terrain analysis that happened word for word to match the work of a female A-10 pilot that nobody in the battalion took seriously. Rachel put the folded paper inside the kneeboard. She did not speak. There was nothing to say yet. She closed the cover and tucked it back under her arm. Pruitt was still looking at the vehicles. She said, "Thank you, Sergeant." He nodded once, the way men of his generation acknowledge things that matter without making a performance of them. She walked toward the flight line. Captain Rachel Marsh had grown up in eastern Kentucky in a house that smelled of engine oil and old books, the daughter of a man who worked rotating shifts at a machine plant and spent his free hours teaching her the things he considered essential: how to read a topographic map, how to calculate wind drift on a moving target, how to hold a position under pressure long enough for the pressure to become information rather than noise. Her father was not a military man himself, but his father had been, and his father before that, and the values had passed down in the quiet way that values pass between men and their children in places where nobody has time for speeches. She had been accepted to flight school on her first application, graduated in the top 4% of her class, earned an A-10 slot through a combination of aptitude scores, spatial reasoning assessments, and a flight evaluation board report that used the word exceptional twice in 3 paragraphs, which was twice more than they usually used it. The A-10 Warthog was not a glamorous aircraft. It was not fast or sleek or the kind of machine that ended up on posters. It was a flying gun platform, a close air support workhorse designed to absorb damage and keep flying, to operate at low altitudes in bad conditions, to put precision fire within meters of friendly troops when everything else had failed. It was ugly in the way that truly useful things are often ugly, and it required a specific kind of pilot, methodical, patient, technically precise with the temperament to work in exactly the places where the situation had already gone wrong and the margin for error had gone to 0. Rachel Marsh was built for it. In the simulator, her gun runs were measured in the same unit as a metronome. In the air, her target acquisition times sat at the low end of the squadron distribution. Her instrument scan was described by her flight school instructor as the cleanest I have evaluated in 11 years. He had written that in her record, and apparently nobody had read it, or if they had read it, they had decided it was outweighed by other considerations. Her height, perhaps, which was 5 feet 3 inches, or her relative quiet at unit social events, or simply the arithmetic by which some organizations assign value to people before they have had any reason to. She had been at Fort Liberty for 14 months. In those 14 months, she had been assigned to 0 combat missions: communications monitoring, equipment inventory review, scheduling support, airspace deconfliction coordination, twice running PowerPoint slides for briefings that other pilots presented. She had completed every assignment with the same precision she applied to everything else and said nothing about the distribution. Instead, she had built her own program in the margins of the schedule. Late nights in the simulator, running gun run profiles until the inputs were automatic. Early mornings studying sectional charts and satellite imagery under a clip light in the corner of the briefing room. Kneeboard pages filled with weapons, data, terrain analysis, fuel calculations. She had studied Kessler Valley specifically for 6 days after it appeared on the operations board as a potential objective, pulling every available imagery product, cross-referencing elevation data, mapping the dead ground angles, working through the geometry of how a force moving in convoy along the primary axis would look from the high ground on the east and west ridges. 6 days to produce the report she submitted through proper channels. 4 days for Colonel Grant Weston to strip her name off it and call it his own. Weston was 52 years old, a career officer with a service record that included 2 Gulf deployments and a command tour in Iraq that had produced 2 commendations and no notable failures. He moved through Fort Liberty with the ease of a man who knew which rooms to enter and which conversations to control. He was not stupid. Men who were merely stupid did not last long enough to reach his rank. He was something more specific than stupid. He was the kind of smart that had spent 20 years rewarding itself for being smart until it had lost the ability to imagine being wrong. He was also Rachel had understood within her first week at the unit, 6 weeks away from a promotion review board. That board would examine his operational record, his planning documents, his demonstrated judgment. A terrain analysis identifying a complex kill zone in advance of a major operation would read well in a package. Better if it appeared to originate with the senior commander rather than a pilot nobody had heard of who was scheduled to monitor communications while the real work happened. She reached the flight line. Her A-10 sat on the apron in the early morning light, painted in standard gray, angular, and blunt and indifferent to aesthetics. The maintenance crew had signed it off at 0530, full loadout, pylons checked, cannon harmonics confirmed. She walked the aircraft, slowly beginning at the nose and working aft in the sequence she had run so many times that her feet moved through it without thought. She checked each pylon, each panel seam, ran her hand along the leading edge of the port wing, crouched to look at the main gear, without letting the knee go below a certain angle. She noted 3 items in the knee board, all minor, all within parameters. Then she went to the briefing. The battalion operations briefing was held in the main briefing room at 0730, a long, low-ceiling space with folding chairs arranged in rows and a projector throwing light onto a screen at the front. The room held approximately 60 people. The air smelled of coffee and boot polish and the tension of a room full of people who knew something significant was beginning. Rachel took a seat near the back, center row aisle side. She opened the knee board on her thigh and kept a pencil between her fingers. Colonel Weston entered at 0732, and the room came to attention without being called to it. He moved to the front with the confidence of a man who had run this kind of room many times. Broad-shouldered gray at the temples, his uniform pressed with the severity of someone who understood that appearance communicated authority before a single word was spoken. He began the brief. The operation was a valley sweep. 540 Marines attachments included would enter Kessler Valley from the primary western ingress, conduct a movement to contact along the valley floor, secure 3 designated objectives, and extract via the same route once objectives were confirmed clear. Intelligence assessment indicated light resistance. Terrain analysis, and here Weston clicked to the slide and Rachel watched 3 paragraphs appear on the screen. Her paragraphs, her grid references, her analytical language. In Weston's brief indicated a manageable threat environment with appropriate precautions. He did not look at her when he clicked to that slide. She did not expect him to. She studied the slide for a moment, confirmed what she already knew from Pruitt's document. Then she wrote 1 word in the knee board and underlined it twice. Trap. When Weston paused for questions, she raised her hand, not dramatically. To shoulder height, steady the pencil still between her fingers. Weston looked at her with the expression of a man who has identified something unexpected on an otherwise clear schedule. She said, "Sir, the valley ingress route passes through 3 convergent defilade angles between grid references, Tango 74 and Tango 79. The geometry at those points creates interlocking fields of fire from the east and west ridgelines simultaneously. Machine gun positions on the spurs, RPG teams in the secondary draw, and the convoy axis runs straight through the dead ground between them for approximately 400 meters. It is a classic kill box configuration." The room was quiet. She continued, "I would recommend either a modified ingress route that avoids the eastern spur exposure or an initial air asset pre-clearance pass on the ridgelines before the ground element enters. Either option reduces the risk significantly." She stopped speaking. She was watching Weston. He did not look at the map. He looked at her name tape. "Captain Marsh." He paused for the precise duration that communicated dismissal without requiring explanation. "We have a coordinated plan. The terrain analysis has been completed." He tapped the slide behind him without looking at it. "Your assignment is communications monitoring. I would suggest you focus there." A sound moved through the room. Not laughter exactly, something between laughter and the exhale that follows it, the social release of a room choosing a side. She lowered her hand, wrote another line in the knee board. Weston clicked to the next slide. The briefing continued for another 19 minutes. She listened to all of it. When it ended, the room broke into organized noise. Rachel stayed in her seat until the initial movement had cleared, then stood close the knee board and made her way to the exit. Near the door, Weston was receiving something from his operations officer. He did not look up as she passed. She did not pause. Outside, the morning had moved. The sun was higher, the clay lot radiating heat that had nowhere to go. Marines were loading the last equipment onto transports. The motor pool was deep in the final choreography of departure, a complex organized motion that Holt Pruitt orchestrated from his position near the center of it, moving from vehicle to vehicle with his thermos and his clipboard, and the quiet authority of someone who had sent enough columns out to know what final preparation actually required. She crossed to him. He watched her approach, read her face. She said, "They're going in the primary road." He did not answer that. She said, "All 540. He looked at the transports. At Declan, who was now helping a younger Marine secure a weapons case to a vehicle rack, showing him how to run the strap and why the angle mattered, the exact gesture his father had made over different equipment 30 years before in a different desert. Pruitt said, "I kept copies of everything." She looked at him. He met her eyes. "Every report you submitted, every date stamp, I kept copies." His voice was level, not urgent, just accurate, in case it mattered later. She looked at him for a moment, at the lines of his face, at the way he held himself, the posture of men who have carried weight for a long time and stopped noticing its presence because it has become the same thing as standing. She said, "Thank you, Sergeant." He nodded, looked back at the transports. She walked back toward the flight line. At its edge, she stopped, turned once, just long enough. 540 people were loading into vehicles pointed at a valley she had mapped to the centimeter. She knew those folds. She knew the exact angle at which the East Ridge dropped into shadow after 1,400 hours, and what that meant for a machine gun team with a scope. She knew the draw where the secondary access trail created a natural RPG position with a clean shot at a 40-meter kill zone on the valley floor. She knew the 400-meter stretch where a convoy would be flanked on both sides simultaneously, with no cover and no exit. She knew it the way she knew the numbers in her kneeboard, not as information, as geometry. The cold, permanent logic of terrain that does not change regardless of what a briefing slide says about it. The convoy began to move. Dust rose behind the first vehicles, catching the morning light in long amber columns. She turned back to her aircraft, checked her watch. She had communications monitoring duty in 30 minutes. She walked to the aircraft and sat down on the step beneath the cockpit, opened the kneeboard and began going through the sequence she had run in the simulator 100 times. Not because she planned to fly, not because anyone had asked her to, because the geometry was already done and the terrain was already in her head, and if any part of what she feared was about to happen, then she needed to be ready in the time it took to reach the flight line from wherever she was standing when the radio broke. She worked through the numbers, cannon harmonics at current temperature and humidity, pylon loadout and recoil compensation, wind shift calculation for the ridgeline orientation she had mapped, fuel burn at low altitude attack profile, the minimum safe offset for a gun pass at the spur geometry without encroaching on friendly ground positions. She wrote it all down, neat columns, no wasted space. Then she turned to a blank page at the back of the kneeboard, thought for a moment, and wrote a single sentence at the top. 20 minutes of effective control at combat G-load before degraded response. She looked at it, added one word minimum. Then she closed the kneeboard. That evening, as the light went low and the compound settled into the night rhythm of a base with a major operation in the field, Holt Pruitt sat alone in the motor pool office with his phone on the desk in front of him. The room smelled of grease and old coffee. Outside, a security light hummed against the dark. His phone buzzed. He picked it up. A text from Declan, sent from a field position somewhere in the approach to Kessler Valley, probably patchy signal, possibly the last chance at a connection before they were too deep for reliable coverage. It said, "Dad, the valley looks exactly like what that pilot warned about. I could see the angles from the road in. Tell her she was right." Pruitt read it twice. He set the phone down on the desk, face up so the screen glowed in the dim room. He sat for a long time without moving. Outside, the security light kept humming. The compound was quiet. The transports were already deep in the dark by now, 540 people moving toward a valley that one 27-year-old pilot with a titanium knee and an old leather kneeboard had mapped in complete detail, submitted through proper channels, and been told in front of a room full of people to stay in her lane. Pruitt reached into his desk drawer, removed a manila folder. Inside it were 17 pages. Every terrain analysis report Rachel Marsh had submitted since arriving at Fort Liberty. Every date stamp, every routing confirmation, 14 months of work that nobody had read except him. He closed the folder and put it back in the drawer. Then he sat in the dark and waited for morning the way fathers do when there is nothing left to do but wait and everything in the world rides on what the morning brings. The radio broke at 8:47. Not all at once. It broke the way things break when they have been under pressure for a long time and finally find the point where the pressure wins. First, a single transmission from the lead vehicle cut off mid-sentence. Then two voices overlapped on the same frequency, both trying to report something and neither completing the thought. Then a sound that anyone who had monitored combat communications long enough would recognize, without being told what it was, the sound of a man's voice changing register in the half-second between normalcy and the moment the world in front of him explodes. Rachel was at the communications station in the operations center when it happened. The operations center at Fort Liberty was a wide, low room lined with screens and workstations, the kind of space that smelled permanently of recycled air and the staleness of equipment running continuously. A dozen personnel occupied their stations at any given time during an active operation. Overhead screens showed drone feeds, map overlays, convoy position markers, and the Blue Force tracker display, where each element of the 540 showed as a discrete icon moving along the valley floor. Rachel had been monitoring the communications net for 41 minutes when the lead vehicle transmission cut off. She adjusted her headset, waited, listened. The second transmission broke through. Contact report partial, the call sign from Bravo's lead truck. East Ridge. Then the overlap of another voice trying to come up on the same net. Then the sound. She was already looking at the drone feed when the first thermal blooms appeared on the East Ridge line. Muzzle signatures. Multiple spread across a 200-meter arc oriented down into the valley floor. A second cluster appeared on the west spur 3 seconds later. Then the draw between them lit up with the smaller, sharper signature of RPG backblast. She had drawn this picture 17 days ago in pencil on a kneeboard page. It was precise. The room changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way a room full of trained people changes when something moves from a projected possibility to a confirmed event. Voices dropped in volume and rose in speed simultaneously. Bodies went still, except for hands. The watch officer pulled off his headset and put it back on again in the same motion. Colonel Weston entered from the side corridor 30 seconds later, already buttoning his cuff, already moving toward the main screen with the forward momentum of a man who expected the room to orient itself around his arrival. He looked at the thermal display, at the Blue Force tracker, at the convoy icons that had stopped moving. He said, "What is the current contact report?" The watch officer gave it to him in clipped format. Multiple contact points, East Ridge and West Spur, confirmed RPG engagement from the secondary draw lead element, immobilized Bravo, pinned Charlie attempting to push forward on the secondary track and being suppressed. Weston looked at the map overlay, his jaw set in a way that communicated processing rather than alarm. He was not a man who panicked. Rachel would grant him that much. He said, "Get me artillery clearance, get the medevac package on standby." Rachel was listening to the communications net with her right ear and listening to the room with her left. On the net, the voices from the valley were doing what voices do when the ground is being cut up around them and the options are narrowing. They were working, calling positions, calling casualty reports, calling for fire. They were doing everything right. The problem was not the people in the valley. The problem was the geometry of the valley, which did not care what they did right. She turned to the map display and began running the numbers in her head. The East Ridgeline spur, where the first muzzle signatures had appeared, was at approximately 900 meters from the nearest friendly element. The west spur was closer 650 meters with a clean depression angle into the convoy axis. The RPG position in the secondary draw was the anchor. It controlled the escape route. As long as that position was active, the convoy could not push forward and could not pull back without presenting a flank to the draw. She looked at the drone feed angle, partial view of the east spur, enough to confirm position. The west spur was in shadow from the camera angle, but she had the geometry from her own analysis and she knew where the team would be. She had mapped exactly where they would be. She did the gun run calculation in 40 seconds. Offset approach axis, minimum safe distance from the nearest friendly position, wind correction for the current valley orientation cannon, harmonics at current temperature. She wrote it in the kneeboard without looking down. Her hand knew the columns. Then she stood up. She said to the watch officer evenly, "The RPG position in the secondary draw is the anchor. If it goes down, the convoy can push east into the dead ground behind the spur and establish a defensive perimeter outside the kill zone. A single gun pass offset approach from 270 at 400 knots stays well outside the 200-meter restriction on all three friendly positions. The geometry is clean." The watch officer looked at her, then at Weston. Weston was already moving toward the communications console. He did not look at her when he said, "We follow established fire support coordination procedures, Captain." She said, "The artillery clearance will take 14 minutes minimum. The RPG team will have a clean shot on the secondary track inside 8. That is noted." She stayed standing. Sir, with respect, the 200-meter rule exists to prevent fratricide from imprecise weapon systems. An A-10 gun pass at this offset maintains a minimum 400-meter buffer from all friendly positions. It is not a violation of the restriction. It is a precision solution within existing guidelines. Weston turned from the console. He looked at her fully for the first time since the brief that morning. His expression was not angry. It was something more controlled than anger, more deliberate. The expression of a man who has decided what something is and does not require further information to confirm it. He said, "Your assignment is communications monitoring. Return to your station." In the far corner of the room, Holt Pruitt stood with his arms at his sides. He had come in from the motor pool when the first contact report hit the compound frequency. He had no official role in the operations center. He had simply walked in the way that senior NCOs sometimes walk into rooms where their people are because the building does not have a wall high enough to keep a father from the room where the maps show his son's position. Nobody had stopped him. Nobody stopped Pruitt from rooms he decided to enter. He was watching the Blue Force tracker, watching Declan's Element Charlie Company trying to push up the secondary track and getting pushed back, watching the icons stop and hold and stop again. His phone was in his right hand held against his thigh, with the screen facing outward, his thumb resting along the side. Rachel returned to her station. She picked up her headset, put it on, listened to the valley. Beside her, specialist Okafor was running the communications monitoring station. He was 24 years old, from Richmond, Virginia, with the focused stillness of someone who processed information best when things were moving too fast for other people to keep up. He had been in the unit for 8 months. He had said approximately 6 complete sentences to Rachel in that time, but 3 of those sentences had contained accurate technical observations that nobody else in the room had made, and she had noted that. He was looking at his screen. He was not looking at her. He said quietly, "Not looking up, Captain Marsh." She looked at him. He angled his screen slightly toward her. Just slightly. Just enough. She leaned forward. "Read the log. Read it again." The communications frequency management log showed every active channel modification made in the past 72 hours. Weston's authorization code appeared against a channel lock entry made at 22:14 the previous evening, 14 hours before the first contact report, 14 hours before the convoy left the wire. The channel that had been locked was the dedicated close air support coordination frequency. Her frequency. The lock had been applied before the operation began, before there was any tactical reason to restrict close air support coordination. The only reason to lock that frequency before an operation began was to prevent a specific asset from being called in during the operation. And the only asset that frequency served on this mission, with the rest of the CAS package stood down, was Rachel Marsh's aircraft. He had not merely dismissed her analysis. He had taken her analysis, stripped her name from it, presented it as his own work, and then locked her out of the communications architecture to ensure that even if the ambush she had predicted occurred exactly as she had described, she would have no channel through which to respond. He had planned for both possibilities. In the scenario where her analysis was wrong and the valley was clear, he had still claimed credit for the terrain assessment. In the scenario where her analysis was correct and the valley was a kill box, he had ensured she would be silent while it happened. She sat with that for approximately 4 seconds. Then she closed the knee board, stood up, picked up her flight jacket from the back of the chair, and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Okafor's voice, still quiet, still not looking up from his screen. He said, "I will keep the log open, Captain." She did not turn around. She kept walking. At the door, she passed within 3 feet of Pruitt. He saw her face. He read it completely and without requiring explanation. He said nothing. He turned back to the map, and he raised his phone and pressed record. The compound between the operations center and the flight line was 230 meters of hard-packed red clay. Rachel walked it in the direct sun at 09:04. Her flight jacket opened the kneeboard under her left arm, her right hand loose at her side. The knee was holding. She had taped it in the equipment bay that morning, and it was holding the way it held when she asked it to hold, which was to say it held with managed protest that she had learned to convert into information rather than obstacle. The A-10 was on the apron where she had left it. She sat down on the aircraft step beneath the cockpit and opened the kneeboard. She did not think about authorization or consequence in those moments. Those calculations had already been made in the only way she knew how to make them, which was to lay all the relevant variables in order and examine what they produced. The variables were 540 people in a valley she had mapped. A communications lock applied before the ambush to prevent her from responding to it. Artillery clearance that would take 14 minutes. An RPG anchor position with a clean shot on the secondary track in less than 8. A knee that would give her an estimated 20 minutes of effective aircraft control under combat eye loading before pain degraded her fine motor response. 20 minutes was enough. She knew what 20 minutes could accomplish. She opened to the page she had written that morning. The column of numbers. Cannon, harmonics, pylon, loadout, wind correction, offset geometry. She checked each figure against current conditions. Temperature had risen 4 degrees since she wrote it. She adjusted the harmonics calculation. Wind out of the northwest at 12 knots, valley orientation at 260 degrees, magnetic effective crosswind component at the attack angle was manageable. She wrote the adjusted numbers in the margin in clean pencil marks. No wasted space. Then she turned back to the morning's page and read the single line she had added at the end. 20 minutes of effective control at combat G-load before degraded response. Minimum. She put the knee board in her thigh pocket, stood up, and put on the flight jacket. She taped the knee one more time. Sitting on the aircraft step in the full morning sun, she ran the tape with the same measured pressure she always used. 3 overlapping passes. Firm but not restrictive. The joint needed to move through its full functional range without the wrap creating its own leverage problem. Her hands ran the sequence while her eyes were on the ridge orientation she had memorized from satellite imagery. She stood, tested the joint, it held. She climbed into the cockpit. Engine start moved through her hands without conscious direction. A PU on. Fuel flow. Hydraulics. Avionics. The instruments came alive in the order she expected them. She ran through the weapons check. Cannon harmonics green. Pylon loads confirmed. The GAU-8 rotary cannon housed in the forward fuselage carried enough 30mm ammunition for multiple precise engagement passes, and it was the most accurate airborne gun platform she had ever operated, capable of placing rounds within a meter of intention at the ranges she was planning to work. She keyed the radio, not the locked frequency, a different one. She said, "Tower Viper 206 requesting taxi to runway 27 unscheduled training departure." A pause. Then the tower controller, a young airman who had cleared her for the training range 3 times in the past month and knew her call sign without checking, "Viper 206 winds 290 at 14, runway 27 is clear, you are cleared to taxi." She taxied. Nobody came out of the operations center. Nobody ran across the apron. Nobody appeared on the radio to countermand the clearance. She rolled to the runway hole point and did not stop because stopping was a decision, and she had made the only decision that the number supported. And pausing at the threshold would not change the numbers. It would only reduce the time available to act on them. She pushed the throttles forward. The aircraft accelerated down the runway with the urgent authority of a machine designed to put itself somewhere fast and stay there. And at rotation, she felt the nose come up and the ground fall away, and the knee register the load shift and hold, and she pulled the gear and climbed out low over the tree line to the southwest. She said it once quietly to no one. Broken things still cut. The valley was 42 miles from Fort Liberty. At low-altitude attack profile, she covered it in 7 minutes. From the air, Kessler Valley looked exactly like her kneeboard page. The same 3-fold points in the ridge line, the same dead ground running along the valley floor, the same spur geometry she had mapped from satellite imagery in the quiet of the briefing room. But satellite imagery was flat and silent, and the valley from 400 feet was neither of those things. From 400 feet, it was smoke-burning vehicles, muzzle flash patterns, stitching signatures across the ridgeline, and the visual language of a ground force trying to compress itself into any available cover on a valley floor that had been selected specifically because it offered none. She rolled into a shallow orbit over the western approach and began building the tactical picture. East Spur, she found the primary position at 900 meters. The muzzle signature was consistent with a medium machine gun's sustained fire sweeping the Central Valley floor on a traverse pattern. The position was in a rock depression below the spur crest line, which gave it cover from direct fire but created a specific exposure angle from the northwest. She noted the approach geometry. The buffer to the nearest friendly position was well over 400 meters. She went to the secondary draw next. The RPG team was exactly where she had put them on the kneeboard page. In the draw, 30 meters below the lip with a natural earthen parapet formed by the terrain that gave them a firing platform and protection from direct observation from the valley floor. The clean shot on the secondary track was real. She could see the geometry from her orbit. The track ran within 40 meters of their position at the point of maximum exposure, and any vehicle that moved up that track to attempt a flanking push would be in their engagement envelope before its crew knew they were targeted. The RPG team was the anchor. She checked her watch. 90 seconds in the valley. 8 minutes, 40 seconds since wheels up. Approximately 11 minutes of effective knee function remaining at combat G load before the degraded response curve began. She was not working with comfortable margins. She began with the draw. The approach she had calculated that morning put her on an axis that avoided the friendly position at maximum offset. It used the terrain fold of the western ridge to mask her approach until she was 3 seconds from the release point and gave her a firing window of approximately 1.4 seconds before she needed to break off to avoid the ridgeline. 1.4 seconds with the GAU-8 at the correct harmonics was enough. She rolled in. The approach felt exactly like the simulator profile except for 3 things. The valley walls moved past faster than any simulator rendered them. The smoke from the burning vehicles created a visibility layer at approximately 200 feet that required 2 small attitude corrections in the final 4 seconds of the approach. And the knee as the aircraft loaded through the turn registered a sharp specific message that she converted immediately from sensation into information and noted without responding to it. She was over the draw at 412 knots. The cannon fired in a controlled burst, steady and authoritative, and the RPG position absorbed it and went silent. She pulled off to the north, climbing, feeling the G load on the joint and accepting it, banking to clear the ridgeline, already running the approach for the east spur before she had reached pattern altitude. On the radio, the valley net was beginning to change. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that radio traffic changes when something that was happening has stopped happening and the people on the ground are trying to work out what changed and why. A voice from Bravo, RPG position is down, secondary track is open. Another voice, control, but edged with surprise. Who is on Overwatch? We do not have cleared CAS. No one answered that. She rolled in on the east spur. The approach geometry from the northwest put her at the correct exposure angle to the machine gun depression. The firing window was 1.8 seconds at this profile. The terrain gave her a natural masking approach from behind the spur crest that minimized her exposure to return fire. She rolled in with the same measured input she used in the simulator, felt the aircraft track, held the pipper, and fired. The machine gun position went quiet. She pulled off, climbing hard, and the knee told her what the G meter already showed, and she noted the information and continued the pull until she was clear of the ridgeline. In the brake, she ran the calculation. West spur 370 meters from a confirmed friendly position. She had done this offset in the simulator at 340 meters and held it inside the accuracy envelope 61 times, and she had the numbers. She ran the west spur. Below her, the valley floor was changing. The compressed positions of the friendly force were beginning to relax. Small movements at first, individual figures shifting from cover to cover in the direction of the secondary track. Then larger movements, vehicle engines starting, the thermal signatures of exhaust flickering to life. She heard the radio change again. This time the quality was different. The voices were no longer just working. They were working with something not present before, which was the awareness that something above them was making the geometry work, that the clean shots were becoming unavailable, that the fixed positions controlling the valley floor were going dark one by one in a sequence too precise to be artillery, too sustained to be a drone, too low and loud, and present to be anything that operated remotely. A voice from the valley, what is that? That isn't a 10. Silence for a moment on the net. Then a different voice, older, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who had heard a 10-gun passes before. Somebody is working this valley. Find out who cleared them. She checked her watch. 11 minutes, 20 seconds since wheels up. The knee was at the edge of what she had estimated. Not past it, at the edge of it. She had 1, maybe 2 more effective passes before the degraded response curve began to affect her trigger timing and aircraft control. Precision and imprecision was not something she was prepared to accept at these offsets. She identified the command node. It was in the northern tree line at the valley head, a cluster of signatures indicating vehicle-mounted communications equipment and the thermal density of multiple personnel in close proximity, which was what a command element looked like from 400 feet when you knew what you were looking for. The command node was where the ambush coordination was coming from. With the RPG anchor gone and 2 of the 3 ridge positions silent, the enemy was adapting, trying to reorient remaining assets. The command node was where those instructions originated. She ran the geometry. 300 meters from the nearest friendly position, the tightest she had worked today. She had done 300 meters in the simulator 61 times and held the accuracy requirement on 58 of them. She noted the 3 she had not held. She noted the current condition of her knee, her fatigue level, and the smoke layer in the valley that would require the same type of attitude correction she had made on the first pass. She ran the number. It was acceptable. She rolled in. The approach was clean until the final 7 seconds when a secondary smoke layer at 220 feet required a correction she had not fully accounted for, shifting her approach axis by a degree and a half. She had approximately 2 seconds to decide whether to continue or break off. She continued. The gun fired for 2 seconds, not 3. She was already breaking off when the rounds impacted, pulling the aircraft away from the ridgeline, with the knee registering specific technical objections that she logged and set aside, and the command node absorbed the burst, and the radio traffic from the northern tree line went silent and did not resume. She pulled off to altitude and orbited, breathing. Below her, the valley was moving again. The blue force icons were no longer static. They were pushing up the secondary track elements, moving with the directional purpose of people who have been given an opening and know how long openings last. The vehicles that could move were moving. The vehicles that could not were being consolidated, covered, their personnel redistributed. The valley was not safe, it was not over. But the geometry had changed, and the geometry was the thing that had made it a kill box. And without the geometry, it was simply a valley with a fight in it, and fights in valleys were things that 540 well-trained people knew how to manage. She checked her knee. The joint was past the 20-minute mark. She was managing it. She stayed in the orbit. In the operations center at Fort Liberty, the radio net was a different kind of chaos. Holt Pruitt was standing in the same position he had occupied since Rachel walked out, phone raised, recording. He had not moved. He was recording the screens, the room, the voices, and specifically Weston, who had identified the unauthorized aircraft in the valley from the drone feed and was now working through a sequence of responses with the deliberate precision of a man managing a situation that had moved outside his control. Weston said, "Get me a call sign identification on that aircraft." A communications technician ran the query. Beside Pruitt, Okafor was at his station with his hands moving carefully across the keyboard, not with urgency, but with the methodical steadiness of someone who understood that this moment was generating a record and that the record needed to be complete. He was logging every channel entry, every timestamp, every voice call in the room with the backing of the communications log he had already preserved to a secondary storage location that morning, before Rachel walked out, before she sat down on the aircraft step, before she started the engines. Because the log Weston had created when he locked her frequency was the kind of evidence that disappeared from primary systems. And Okafor was 24 years old and from Richmond, and he understood that things which needed to survive needed to live in more than one place. The communications technician said, "Sir, the call sign is Viper 206. Weston was still. In the back of the room, one of the watch staff said it quietly, not to anyone in particular, just as a response to the sound of the name, "That is Marsh." Weston turned. He looked at the drone feed, at the aircraft making a shallow orbit over the valley, while the blue force icons moved with renewed purpose toward the extraction point. He looked at it for 3 seconds. Then he looked at the communications console. He picked up the handset and keyed the operations frequency, the open frequency, the one that every station in the building could monitor, and that the automatic recording system was logging in real time. He said with precise command clarity, the voice of a man establishing a record, all stations, this is Weston 6. Viper 206 is operating without authorization in the Kessler Valley area. Viper 206, you are ordered to withdraw from the operational area immediately. This is a direct order. Acknowledge." The frequency was open. The frequency was being logged. Pruitt watched Weston's face as he said it. He had been watching faces for 40 years, and he knew what he was watching. He was watching a man who understood that the aircraft in the valley was saving the operation and possibly 540 lives, and who was simultaneously constructing the paper record that would define this moment as his order being disobeyed rather than his lock being circumvented. Weston was not calling Rachel back because he wanted the operation to fail. He was calling her back on an open recorded frequency because he needed the record to show that he had maintained authority throughout. Pruitt lowered his phone slightly. He turned it 90 degrees so the camera angle included Weston, the communications console, the screens showing the valley, and the clock on the wall showing the timestamp. Then he walked to Okafor's station. He leaned down and said quietly, "Log everything, every word he says, every timestamp, everything that screen shows." Okafor did not look up. He said equally quietly, "Already on it, Sergeant." Pruitt straightened up, turned back to the screens. On the drone feed, a small gray aircraft made another orbit over the southern approach to Kessler Valley. Below it, the last vehicles of the convoy were moving up the secondary track toward the extraction point. The blue force icons were consolidating. They were moving. Pruitt's phone was in his right hand. The recording light was on. He looked at the screen where Declan's element showed as a moving icon on the secondary track, and he watched it move, and he did not take his eyes off it, and he did not stop recording. On the open frequency, there was no response from Viper 206. The last helicopter lifted out of Kessler Valley at 1347. Rachel was still in her orbit when it cleared the southern ridgeline. She watched it on her radar altimeter display tracking the altitude gain, and she stayed in the orbit until the aircraft was 3 minutes clear of the valley floor and climbing on a heading that would take it home. Only then did she ease the throttles back, raise the nose, and begin the transit back to Fort Liberty with the physical awareness of someone who has been running on controlled adrenaline for a measured period of time and is now for the first time allowing herself to take an inventory of the damage. The knee was past what she had estimated, not catastrophically, not in a way that made the aircraft difficult to fly, but the joint was communicating with her in terms that were no longer abstract, and she flew the transit home with her right leg, making small compensating adjustments that she logged without comment in the back of her mind as information to be examined later when there was time for examination. The flight back was 42 miles. She covered it in 8 minutes. On final approach to Fort Liberty, she set up the aircraft with the same precision she had used that morning, same crosswind correction, same approach angle, same touchdown, aim point on the 27 center line. The landing was firm. The knee registered the deceleration load, and she acknowledged it and taxied off the runway and back to the apron without stopping. She shut down the engines. In the silence after the turbines wound down, she sat in the cockpit for approximately 30 seconds. Running the post-mission sequence in her head, confirming the aircraft state, noting the fuel state, the rounds expended, the time airborne. She opened the knee board and wrote the numbers. Rounds fired passes executed estimated ground time from wheels up to final gun run. She was writing the third entry when she heard the first helicopter arriving. She climbed down from the cockpit. The flight line was not empty the way it had been that morning. People had come out of buildings, not in formation, but in the way that people move towards something when they know something has happened, and the thing that happened is arriving in front of them. Maintenance crews, administrative personnel, a group of younger Marines who had been assigned to rear area duties and had spent the last 4 hours listening to the radio traffic from Kessler Valley and understanding in the way of people who know what radio traffic sounds like that the afternoon had been very close to something else entirely. The helicopters were coming in 2 at a time. The first pair touched down and the doors came open, and the Marines who walked off them had the look of people who have been in a sustained firefight for several hours and have survived it and have not yet fully converted that survival into anything resembling relief. Dust covered some bandaged moving with the slightly disconnected precision of people operating on the far side of exhaustion. The serious casualties had already been diverted to the field hospital, the flight manifest showing 3 critical and 11 significant. The people walking off these aircraft were the ones who had walked out under their own authority. Rachel stood at the edge of the flight line and watched them come off. The second pair of helicopters landed, and the door of the rear aircraft opened, and Corporal Declan Pruitt stepped off onto Fort Liberty ground with his rifle across his chest and his helmet tilted at an angle that suggested the strap had been knocked loose at some point and never fully reset, and his face was the color of old concrete, and his hands were not quite steady, and he was alive. He was completely unambiguously alive. Holt Pruitt was at the edge of the pad. He had come from the operations center sometime in the previous hour. When Declan came off the aircraft and crossed the pad and reached his father, neither of them said anything. Holt put his right hand on his son's left shoulder and held it there. Declan's jaw moved. He looked away from his father's face and then back at it, and both of them stood still for a moment in the way that 2 people stand still when everything that needs to be said has already been communicated, and words are simply the insufficient second draft of something that needed no revision. Rachel looked at them for 1 second, then she looked away. She had been on the apron for 40 seconds when she heard boots behind her, moving with purpose, not running, but with the deliberate rhythm of someone closing distance who has been waiting for this moment and has already decided what it will contain. She stopped. She turned. Colonel Grant Weston was crossing the apron at the pace of a man who understood that his authority was expressed in his bearing and that his bearing under these circumstances needed to communicate complete control. 2 officers from his staff were a step behind him. He had changed his shirt since the morning. The new one was pressed. He stopped 4 feet from her. He said, "You disobeyed a direct order, Captain." His voice was level, clear, the voice of a man who had considered his opening line and chose this one because it was accurate and because it established the framework of what followed before anything else could be established first. She said, "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment, at her uniform which was damp with sweat and carried the grime of someone who had been in an aircraft under combat conditions for the better part of 2 hours. At her face, which gave him nothing that he hadn't put there himself by asking the question. He said, You are hereby informed that I will be recommending a formal Article 32 hearing to review your conduct today. Willful disobedience of a direct order in an active operational area is a serious matter and will be treated as one." She said nothing. He continued, "Additionally, I am placing a hold on your flight status pending review of your medical record, specifically the orthopedic restriction noted in your file from the incident 18 months ago. Operating an aircraft in a combat environment with an uncleared medical restriction is a separate matter and will be referred to the flight surgeon's office for assessment." There it was. She had known this was coming in the way that she had known the valley was a kill box, not because she could see it happening, but because the geometry of it was clear if you looked at the angles honestly. He needed the disobedience charge because it was accurate and because it reframed the afternoon as a breakdown in command authority rather than a breakdown in command judgment. And he needed the medical charge because the disobedience charge alone might not survive the review board once the outcome of the afternoon was entered into evidence. The medical charge was the anchor. The disobedience charge was the RPG position in the draw. She recognized the geometry. She said, "Yes, sir." Weston held her eyes for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked back toward the operations center with his staff officers at the same deliberate pace, his bearing expressing everything he needed it to express for the benefit of everyone watching, which was everyone on the flight line. Rachel turned and walked to the hangar. She sat down on a ground equipment case in the far corner, opened the knee board, and began writing her post-mission log. Wheels up time area of operations, initial target assessment engagement sequence, round expenditure, wheels down time. She wrote it in the same compact script she had used for 14 months of kneeboard pages, every number in its column, every entry dated and timed. She wrote for 20 minutes without interruption. Then she closed the kneeboard, stood up, and went to find the flight surgeon. The next 48 hours moved the way difficult hours move when the outcome is not yet determined and every piece of available information is being arranged by multiple people with competing interests. Rachel was confined to non-operational status. Her flight records were pulled. Her medical file was reviewed. The Article 32 recommendation generated paperwork that moved through the legal office with the institutional velocity of a document that has a senior officer's signature on it. She was not worried about the medical finding. Her knee was a documented injury with a documented recovery and a flight surgeon's evaluation that had cleared her for unrestricted flight status 11 months ago. That evaluation existed in the official record and could not be altered by a hold or a referral or a secondary review because it had been written by a board-certified flight surgeon and signed by 2 independent reviewing physicians. And the only way to overturn it was with a new evaluation that produced different findings, and a new evaluation would require her cooperation, which she would provide because the joint was what it was, and what it was had just flown 2 hours of combat maneuvering and landed the aircraft safely, and the numbers would show exactly that. She was not worried about the medical finding. The Article 32 was different. The Article 32 was a hearing that would examine the facts of the afternoon and determine whether they constituted a punishable offense. The facts were not in dispute. She had disobeyed a direct order. That was accurate. The question was whether the context of that disobedience, the outcome of it, and the circumstances that preceded it were relevant to how the facts should be understood. She did not know the answer to that question. She knew the geometry of it, but geometry and institutional outcomes were not the same thing, and she had been at Fort Liberty long enough to understand that. On the evening of the second day, she was sitting in the hangar with the kneeboard open when Pruitt appeared in the doorway. He came in without announcement, walked to the center of the hangar floor, and sat down on a crate across from her without being invited and said nothing for a moment, while the hangar settled around them with its familiar smell of hydraulic fluid and metal and the cool darkness of a large enclosed space in the evening. He said, "There are 3 of them." She looked at him. He said, "Pilots, from other units. They have been talking to each other since the news got out about Kessler Valley." He reached into his chest pocket and removed a folded page. "Captain Diane Sorrell, 23rd Wing, Fort Carson. She filed a terrain analysis report on an operation in Ramadi in 2019 that was attributed to Weston in the planning documents. The original is in her personal files." He unfolded the page. "Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 74th Fighter Squadron. He wrote a threat assessment before an operation in Helmand in 2021 that appeared verbatim in Weston's operational brief. He kept the draft." He looked at her. "First Lieutenant Andrea Tague, Fort Campbell, separated from service in 2022. She flagged a route exposure problem before a convoy operation in southern Afghanistan. Weston overrode her assessment without review. 3 vehicles were disabled in an IED strike on the route she flagged. She filed a formal complaint. It was administratively closed. Rachel was still. Pruitt refolded the page. He said, "None of them knew about each other until now. They each thought it was their situation alone. When Kessler Valley went out on the wire, they started comparing notes." He put the page on the equipment case beside her. "They have documentation, all three of them." She looked at the folded page. Pruitt said, "They want to testify." She said, "Why are you telling me this tonight?" He said, "Because the legal office called this afternoon and the Article 32 is scheduled for 10 days from now. And because Declan asked me why you flew into that valley without authorization." He paused. "I told him the truth. He said he wants to testify too." She was quiet. He stood up. He looked at her directly and without ornamentation. He said, "I have everything I recorded in the operations center. I have the communications log Okafor preserved. I have 17 months of your reports with every date stamp and every routing confirmation." He looked at the knee board in her hands. "What is in that is yours. What I have is what the system generated when it tried to bury what is in that. That is a different kind of document." He turned and walked to the doorway, stopped. He said without turning back, "Declan would have been in the secondary track vehicle when the RPG team took the clean shot, the one you eliminated on the first pass." He walked out. She sat in the hangar for a long time after he left. The evening outside the open doors went from amber to blue to the dark of a military installation at night. Security lights humming at their posts, the flight line quiet and orderly, and fully indifferent to the sequence of events that had brought her to this equipment case. She opened the knee board. She turned to the current page and read the post-mission log she had written 2 days ago. Every number in its column, every entry accurate. She read it through once and then closed it. Then, for a reason she could not have explained precisely, she turned the knee board over and opened it from the back instead of the front. She turned past the last page of her notes, past the blank pages, past the cardboard backing, to the front cover, the inside of the front cover, the page she had never used, the page she had never had reason to open because the knee board had come to her already closed, and she had simply opened it to the first blank page and started writing, and had written forward from there for 14 months, and the front cover page had remained untouched, private, in the way that first pages are sometimes private without anyone deciding they should be. There was writing on it, blue ink, a different hand than hers, smaller letters more forward-slanting, the penmanship of someone who had learned to write before ballpoint pens were universal and had kept the habit of the older style. She knew the handwriting the way she knew her own face. She had seen it on birthday cards and grocery lists and the margins of paperback books, and once on a note tucked inside her flight school acceptance letter that she had kept in the back of her own wallet until the paper wore through at the folds. Her father had given her the knee board on the day she graduated from flight school. She had opened it to the first blank page and started writing, and she had not opened the front cover page in 14 months. The handwriting said, "The mission doesn't wait for permission. Fly true." She read it once. She read it again. She closed the knee board and held it in both hands and sat in the hangar, with the security lights humming outside and the flight line quiet and the dark complete, and she was still for a long time. Not crying, her father had not raised a crier, and he had not been one himself, and she honored that in the same way she honored everything he had given her, which was by carrying it forward without ceremony. But she was still in the way that a person is still when something incomplete for a long time becomes complete, when the last piece of a geometry that has been building for years finally resolves into a form that can be seen whole. She had flown for him before she knew she was flying for him. The review board convened 10 days later in a conference room in the Judge Advocate General's building on the north side of Fort Liberty. The room had the institutional neutrality of a space designed to process important events without reflecting them. Fluorescent light, a long table, a 3-officer panel in formal service dress seated at the table's head, a court recorder at a smaller table to the left. Seats along the wall for witnesses arranged in the order they would be called. Rachel sat at the respondent's table in her service dress, her knee board in front of her closed. The morning began with the formal reading of the specifications. Violation of Article 92, failure to obey a lawful order. The order in question was Weston's transmission on the open operations frequency directing Viper 206 to withdraw from the operational area. The facts of the violation were stipulated. She had received the transmission. She had not complied. This was accurate, and she did not dispute it. The presiding officer was a colonel named Hargrove, who carried a quality of attention that comes from long experience with proceedings where the documented facts and the actual situation are not the same thing, and where the difference between them is what the board's function is to examine. The first witness called was Weston himself. He testified for 40 minutes. His account of the afternoon is accurate in its chronology and framing. He had issued a lawful order. The order had not been followed. The operational protocols that generated the order were established procedures applied consistently with standing doctrine. His voice was controlled throughout. His posture communicated the bearing of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and understands that his demeanor is part of his argument. He was a good witness for himself. When cross-examination reached the terrain analysis section of his operational brief, his counsel objected on relevance grounds. Hargrove considered the objection for approximately 4 seconds. Then he said, "I will allow it." His tone communicated that he had expected the objection and had already decided. The cross-examination asked Weston to identify the source of the terrain analysis in his brief. He described it as the product of his operational planning process. He was then presented with Rachel's original report, timestamped 17 days prior to his brief bearing her routing stamp from the official submission system. He was asked whether he had reviewed it. He said he did not recall reviewing it. He was asked whether the language in his brief derived from her report. He said the analysis reflected independent conclusions reached through the same available data. He was then presented with a side-by-side comparison prepared by the legal office that placed both documents in parallel columns. The presiding officer looked at the comparison for a long moment. He did not ask a question about it. He set it down and moved on. Weston's testimony ended. Okafor was called next. He sat at the witness table with the focused stillness he brought to his communication station, and he presented the communications log with a technical clarity that made the board's note-taking audible in the room. He explained the channel management system. He explained what a channel lock meant and what it required to implement. He explained the timestamp of the lock entry and what operational phase that timestamp corresponded to. He explained where the authorization code for the lock had come from. He did not editorialize. He did not characterize. He presented the technical record in sequence and answered each question with the precision of someone who understood that the record was the argument and the argument needed no assistance from tone or implication. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment before Hargrove cleared his throat and called the next witness. Captain Diane Searle came to Fort Liberty from Fort Carson. She was 31 years old, and she walked to the witness table with the unhurried steadiness of someone who had carried this particular folder for 4 years and had learned to hold it without urgency because urgency had not served her the first time, and she had decided that accuracy would serve her better than feeling. She placed her documentation on the table, her original terrain analysis from 2019 timestamped with routing confirmation, Weston's operational planning brief from that same operation, a side-by-side comparison she had built alone in her quarters at Fort Carson on a Tuesday night after Kessler Valley hit the wire when she had finally understood that her situation was not her situation alone. She explained each piece in sequence, answered every question in a voice that did not modulate for effect, and said nothing she could not prove. She testified for 22 minutes, and when she finished, she folded her hands on the table and waited as if she had been waiting for this room for a long time and was in no hurry to leave it. Lieutenant Marcus Webb came after her. He was quieter with the formality of someone who had prepared for this room the way he prepared for missions methodically without enthusiasm for the process, but with complete commitment to executing it correctly. He placed his draft threat assessment beside Weston's brief from Hellman in 2021, and he walked the board through the language with the patience of a technician explaining a system fault to someone who needs to understand it before they can fix it. He did not editorialize. He did not characterize Weston. He simply showed the board what 2 documents contained when placed next to each other and let the placement speak for itself. His voice was steady throughout, and when he was done, he stepped back from the table without drama, as if what he had just done was simply the correct next thing and required no further comment. Andrea Tague had driven from Nashville, and she was no longer in uniform. She sat down at the witness table in civilian clothes and folded her hands and looked at the presiding officer with the directness of someone who had decided 3 years ago that she had nothing left to manage in rooms like this except the truth. She described the route she had flagged, the assessment that had been set aside without formal review, the 3 vehicles disabled in the IED strike on the route she had identified as compromised, the formal complaint filed 8 months later, and the administrative closure notice that had arrived with no explanation and no appeal process, and had ended her service as surely as any order. When she finished, she said only, "I am not asking you to conclude anything on my behalf. I am here because a pattern is only visible from outside it. That is why I came." The room held that sentence before moving on. Declan Pruitt was called after a 15-minute recess. He came in still in uniform corporal's rank on his sleeve, and he sat at the witness table with the straight-back posture of a young man who understood that this room mattered and had decided to carry himself accordingly. He was 22 years old, and he had been in a burning valley 10 days ago, and he was here because his father had asked him if he wanted to testify, and he had said yes without hesitating. He was asked about the text message he had sent to his father on the night before the operation. He confirmed it. He was asked what he had observed of the terrain in the approach to Kessler Valley. He described it in straightforward, tactical terms. He was asked whether in his assessment as an infantryman who had moved through the valley, the terrain configuration matched the threat analysis Captain Marsh had presented at the briefing 3 days before the operation. He said it did, exactly. He was asked one more question. He was asked what he thought the outcome would have been if the RPG position in the secondary draw had not been eliminated before Charlie Company pushed up the secondary track. He looked at the table for a moment, then at the presiding officer. He said, "I do not think I would be sitting here, sir." The room held that as well. Holt Pruitt was the final witness. He came to the table with his manila folder and his phone, and he set both objects on the table in front of him and looked at the presiding officer the way he had looked at all the things in his life that required him to be clear and accurate and steady directly without either deference or defiance, with the frank attention of a man who had nothing to manage in this room except the truth. He submitted the folder, 17 pages, every terrain analysis report Rachel had submitted in 14 months, every date stamp, every routing confirmation. He submitted the recording. The recording was 43 minutes of continuous video from the operations center, beginning before the first contact report from Kessler Valley and ending after the last helicopter had cleared the southern ridgeline. It showed the screens, it showed the map, it showed the radio logs, it showed the moment Weston received the call sign identification, and it showed the expression on his face in the 4 seconds before he picked up the handset to issue the withdrawal order on the open frequency. And it showed the timestamp on that moment, and it showed on the screen behind Weston, at that exact timestamp, the drone feed image of the valley below where the Blue Force icons were already beginning to move toward the extraction point. He had issued the order after the valley was already opening. The record showed it plainly and without ambiguity, because records made by people who understand that the record is all that survives tend to show things that way. Pruitt testified for 31 minutes. He answered every question in the same voice. Steady, unhurried, accurate. The voice of a man who had operated in difficult places for a long time and had learned that the most powerful thing available in a room like this was not argument or persuasion, but simply the unadorned sequence of what happened, laid out in order, allowed to speak. When he was excused, he stood, picked up the folder, put the phone in his pocket, and walked back to his seat along the wall. He did not look at Weston. He did not need to. The board recessed for deliberation at 14:10. Rachel sat in the corridor outside on a wooden bench with her knee board on her knees. Not open, just held the way she had held it through everything else. The corridor smelled of old floor wax and recycled air and the steadiness of a building that had processed difficult events for a long time and would process more of them and was not moved in either direction by any of them. Pruitt sat 2 feet down the bench from her. He did not speak. She did not speak. They sat the way they had always operated together in the companionable silence of two people who had said what needed to be said and were now simply present in the same space while the outcome arrived at its own pace. After 43 minutes, the board recorder opened the conference room door and asked them to come back inside. Hargrove looked at his notes for a moment before he spoke. Then he put the notes down and addressed the room directly. He said the board finds that the order issued by Colonel Weston on the operations frequency on the afternoon in question was in its technical definition a lawful order. Captain Marsh's failure to comply with it was in its technical definition a violation of Article 92. He paused. The board also finds that the circumstances preceding the issuance of that order, specifically the documented suppression of Captain Marsh's original terrain analysis, the unauthorized application of a communications lock to her designated frequency the evening prior to the operation, and the pattern of conduct established by witness testimony from 3 additional officers across 2 theaters in 4 years constitute material context that this board is required to weigh. He looked at his notes once briefly. He said the board recommends dismissal of the Article 32 specification. The board further recommends that the matter of communications protocol violations and the systematic misattribution of subordinate analytical work be referred to the Inspector General's office for separate review. He paused once more before closing. He looked at Weston for the first time during the entire proceeding. He said the board notes that the communications lock applied to Captain Marsh's designated frequency the evening prior to the operation represents a premeditated action, not a tactical judgment made under pressure. That distinction will be material to the Inspector General's review. He gathered his papers with the evenness of a man closing a chapter that had needed closing for a long time. This board is adjourned. Weston sat still at the table as the room began to move around him. His counsel was already speaking in his ear. He was not listening. He was looking at the documents spread across the table in front of him, the side-by-side comparisons, and the time-stamped reports, and the communications log that Okafor had preserved to a secondary system on the morning of an ambush he had not believed would happen. He was looking at 14 months of work that one 27-year-old pilot had done in the margins of every schedule that had tried to keep her out of the room. He had taken her analysis and buried her name. The analysis had saved 540 people. The name was the only thing left standing. Rachel sat with her hands on the kneeboard. She did not feel what she had expected to feel, which was relief. She felt something more specific than relief. The sensation of a long equation finally balanced. The patient accumulation of numbers closing into the form they had been building toward, and the form being exactly what the mathematics had always predicted it would be, and the satisfaction of that being quiet and complete and requiring nothing further. She stood, picked up the kneeboard, walked out. She was still sitting in the hangar on the equipment case with the kneeboard open when she heard boots at the door. Pruitt came in the way he always came in, without announcement, without explanation, as if the building had simply decided to admit him. He walked to the middle of the hangar floor and stopped. He was still in his service dress from the hearing. The manila folder was under his arm. His face carried the quality she had come to associate with him over 14 months, which was the quality of a man who had looked at a hard thing squarely and found it to be exactly as hard as he had expected and had done what needed doing regardless. He held out a folded document. She did not reach for it immediately. He said, "Flight surgeon's office sent it an hour ago. Full flight status restored unrestricted. The secondary review produced identical findings to the original." He paused. There was no finding to overturn. There never was. She took the document, read it, folded it along its crease. He reached into the folder and produced a second page. This one was on official letterhead, a different office, and it bore 2 signatures at the bottom. She read the heading first, then the body of the text, then the 2 signatures. The document was a formal assignment recommendation. The position was Flight Lead Combat Air Support Squadron, Fort Carson, Colorado. The recommending authority was the Judge Advocate Review Board, acting on a motion filed by the 3 witnesses following the hearing's conclusion. The endorsing signature was Colonel Hargrove's. The second signature was Grant Weston's. She read that signature twice. Pruitt said, his counsel told him it was the only version of what happened next that did not end with the IG referral becoming something more significant. He signed it this afternoon. His voice carried no satisfaction in this, just accuracy. The IG referral stands regardless, but he signed it. She looked at the page for a long moment. At Weston's signature, which was the handwriting of a man who had spent 20 years building something and had watched it become the instrument of his own accounting. She did not feel triumph. She felt something quieter and more durable than triumph. She felt the sensation of a geometry resolved. She put both documents inside the kneeboard and closed it. Pruitt looked at her. She said, "How is Declan?" Something moved across his face. Not much, just enough. He said, "He slept last night, first time since the valley." She nodded. He stood in the center of the hangar floor for a moment longer. Outside, the flight line lights had come on fully, the apron lit in the clean geometry of an installation that kept its discipline through darkness and weather and everything else that came at it. The A-10 stood on its hard stand in the line, angular and blunt and without sentiment about what it had done and what had followed. Pruitt looked at the aircraft, at its graceless, purposeful shape, at the cannon housing in the nose that had solved the geometry of Kessler Valley one pass at a time. He said quietly to the aircraft as much as to her, "Your father would have liked knowing how it came out." She did not answer immediately. She turned the kneeboard over in her hands, felt the worn leather edge at the corner where 14 months of daily handling had smoothed it further. Thought about a man who had written a sentence on a blank page and given it to his daughter on the best day she had had yet, and who had never known and could not know that the sentence would sit unread for 14 months and then be found in a hangar in North Carolina after the longest afternoon of her life, and that it would be exactly right. She said he knew. Pruitt held that for a moment. Then he nodded once. The same deliberate nod she had come to understand over 14 months, the nod that carried more than sentences. He turned and walked to the hangar door, stopped at the threshold the way he sometimes stopped not looking back, just pausing in the frame where the hangar light ended and the outside dark began. He said, "Fort Carson is good terrain for what you do." Then he walked out. She sat alone in the hangar for a while after he left. The flight line settled into its nighttime register outside. She opened the kneeboard to a fresh page, picked up her pencil. She wrote the date, she wrote the time, she wrote the assignment, the location, the report date. She wrote it in clean, even lines, every entry in its correct column, because the record mattered and the method mattered, and the numbers were how she kept faith with everything that had brought her to this page. Then she turned back to the front cover. Read the sentence one more time. The mission doesn't wait for permission. Fly true. She closed the kneeboard. Broken things still cut. She picked up the assignment document, tucked it under her arm, alongside the kneeboard, and walked out of the hangar into the lit geometry of Fort Liberty at night, her boots pressing their steady rhythm into the ground, the knee holding the next page already waiting.